Hello, everyone. This is YiFeng, and I'm here with my co-host Lily.
Hello, hello.
I feel like when you need a DJ name, I always feel like you need here is DJ Lily, and then this is Silent Bob or something. I don't know, making things up. Yeah, today we're doing another episode of Watching Silent Films, and we just literally talked about how busy we are, but I feel like for myself, every time I make time to watch this, it's very illuminating, and it's also always expanding my knowledge of not just movies, but I think it taps into all areas of life, at least for me, when I watch stuff like this.
I would have to agree.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. It's also it's sort of like a snapshot of history as well, like a snapshot of what people were thinking about at that time, and it's also fascinating that so many of the things that they were talking about or wanting to communicate in movies is essentially the same thing we're dealing with today. So as the more we feel like it's in the past and these stories seems to be just there, the more relevant it is to the modern times. So that always fascinated me. I was just listening some podcasts from Leonard Maltin. He has a podcast on like a Maltin podcast or something like that. So he interviewed Ken Burns lately. You know Ken Burns, the documentary person who did like most recently he did something like Vietnam War. He did a bunch of stuff like jazz, baseball. He's just over the years he's amassed a huge amount of award-winning just documentaries everywhere, right? And he popularized the what's called Ken Burns effect, which is like it's a still photo, but you're just panning the photo, and you're kind of putting some music to it sometimes, and so that's like in all documentaries, everybody started copying him after he did that. You know what I mean? So that's and then I think Apple or somebody named it after him, the Ken Burns effect, but essentially what it is. Why I bring that up is because he made a point about films, because he's making these films, and about history, and a lot of his stuff is about history, and it's so funny how much of history, as the more you show history in his documentaries, films, the more it's relevant to modern films. It's just so uncanny, because it takes them decades sometimes to do a single topic, and then when it comes to fruition, it always hits like almost just so appropriately in terms of timing, It's just like the movie we're going to watch today. We have already seen. It's called Hands of Orlac. And we've seen the movie before this that they collaborated together. Dr. Caligari, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, previously. But it's the same director, Robert Wiene or something like that. And
apparently his name is supposed to be pronounced Van.
Vine? That's right, because it's German.
I think so. Yeah.
That's right. I'm terrible at pronunciation, but
it's okay. I listened to some German lady say it, so
good.
I'm like, okay. So as long as you know, it's
that's
either
perfect.
like Van or Van.
And
anyway.
the main star, Conrad. I don't know how to pronounce that one.
I think Conrad Veidt.
Right. So I didn't even know about this, but he apparently is that German officer in Casablanca. So if you've seen the movie Casablanca, it's the same guy. It's Major something, and he's like, we're going to enforce the papers and make sure you're, it's that guy. I was like, he almost seems familiar. Even a while ago when I watched this, I couldn't quite pinpoint who he was until I looked it up, and it's like, whoa.
Yeah, he had a great career. It said he was, one of very few actors who made it, to continue his career into sound movies, which is really interesting to me. He did so much work in the silent era, and he pretty much made movies until his death in the 40s.
Well, Casablanca was the one before the last movie he did, and he did a heart attack or something. But it's just amazing because his technique of film acting is pretty modern. Like if you watch this movie, there are parts of it that seems a little bit, but in general, you could almost transpose so much of it into the modern era and be like, wow, this is like a movie from yesterday.
Mm.
At least that's how I saw it. You might feel differently about it, but so yeah. Were you able to watch anything else before I get into that?
Did I?
In the classic realm, they call it.
Nope. Not so much classic, only modern.
Yeah, I haven't had time to watch anything either in the classic realm this week. It's been crazy, but maybe in the future times. So we can dig right in. And again, like many of our podcasts prior, it's gonna be straight spoilers just because it's been around for almost 100 years. So you haven't gotten around to it. Hopefully, even if it's spoiled, it inspires you to try to catch it and watch it, because there's really, truly nothing like watching it in every way. And so, what was the one thing, or maybe a couple of things that jumped out at you right away after you've seen this? Something major, maybe. I don't know.
I guess I could be wrong. Just because of what year it was made, I noticed right away that, it listed who was in production, who the actors were, direction, basically everything behind the scenes. It gave a name to that person. So I was very impressed. I was like, wow. Maybe they started that a couple years prior, but in the previous movie, we didn't see that. So,
yes.
yeah.
We did a little bit.
Did we?
Yeah,
I don't remember.
In the beginning, remember the artwork for the intertitles were pretty amazing. The set design, because the nature of the movie it's very Art Deco and very now we term it German expressionistic, where everything there was a very art design to death. Like, it was amazing, right? The sets and everything. But even the titles, I think I pointed out last week, was pretty well drawn. It took a long time. It looked like, just to do all the various intertitles introducing the movie. I don't think it has much details with it, but it was, I think that was, 1919 or something? Dr. Caligari?
Did I write that?
And this one's 1924.
Yeah.
Well, the Hands of Orlac was 1924, but Dr. Caligari was 1920.
I wrote, yeah.
So I think in the first few podcasts we discussed how historically, prior to 1920s, they didn't really care much about putting titles and who did what, because everybody did almost everything. There was not much of a segmentation of sort of credits. And that only changed post-1920 because of the corporatization of films. So all of the stock, the company, and all the publicly traded, and just the big business, right? Big money. They saw this industry as a huge opportunity, and then started to basically corporatize the structure. This is one of the things about the early women silent filmmakers, but they weren't able to make that transition because people like from Wall Street and the stock trades and big business were still very much sexist, and they wouldn't allow women to be leaders in general. That was the kind of the culture at that time. So that's why post-1920s, you had all this more structured approach of, it's directed by this, done by this, and so forth and so on. So anyways, and I think that affected everyone, both American and internationally, especially the German film industry as well. So that's why the intertitles were more up there. Like if we watched the Birth of a Nation, or even stuff before that, they might have a director's name or maybe the actor's name, but none of the other cast and crew were on there. Like Body and Soul is a good one. You might have like the major people on there, but then the craft services, for example, is not even listed.
Yeah.
But nowadays, even the craft service people have to be on there. So yeah, anything else that was really big that jumped out? I'm not fishing for any. I'm just curious what major things jumped out right after.
Trying to think like major thing. Well, there was the obvious, the part of the plot is there's a big train derailment, and Conrad's character loses his hands.
Right.
So that scene was I thought it was very well done, very intense, very engaging, because it was so realistic, as you were saying. It's very how they might make it nowadays.
Exactly. Which is probably would have been shocking back then.
Yeah.
imagine time traveling and taking just again because it's 2019, taking Avengers Endgame, throwing it back there, like whoa, you know. Not that this is an Endgame, but it's in terms of film language and how you want to communicate from one scene to the next. But also remember, it's been 4 years since 1920, which even more advancements and film evolution has occurred. So,
Right.
In the beginning of movies, it was so significant, going right from, as we were watching, from the 1900s to 1910s, all the way to mid 1910s, where the Birth of Nations stuff came around, and all the way to 1920s. It continues to evolve. I mean, it's almost a decade between this and this Hand of Orlac and Birth of a Nation, and for sure they all have influenced one another. Like they wouldn't be making this in a vacuum. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
But yeah, going off of that, it was a great representation of disaster. Just to keep with that.
I did zoom in a little bit because I watched it on the big screen and on my projector, and then it was basically two trains passing each other, but they cut it right before you could see the obviousness.
Yeah, before
you know what I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's like it's not really head-on collision as you probably might want to do today with CG or whatever, but back then it was so interesting that they chose an angle to elicit this sort of special effect of train head-on collision, but they implied that somebody changed the rail sort of
the
path.
rail tracks.
Yeah. So that part was so interesting. Just so much implying now, not even explaining in the titles.
Yeah, which was very good and compelling, because then it goes to the office with the, I don't know if you don't know their exact titles, the train men.
Yep.
And all those papers just start flying out of the machine. I wasn't, you could tell that they were stressed out. Right. I was really wondering what that meant. I don't know. I was just wondering if it just, collision, or whatever.
Yeah, it's got to be some sort of, I didn't really look into it, but I guess some sort of a telegraph type communication or Morse code or something like that.
Yeah, that would make sense.
Or some sort of pre-telephone. I don't know when telephone came around. It's all around this very similar time frames.
Yeah, so there was that part, and then, just the chaos and everything else. It was kind of, continuing on with the film, too, is a little bit of a mad scientist sort of vibe.
Right.
Which is what we try to get with the horror. So, Conrad loses his hands. He gets the hands of a murderer, and he starts going insane and believes that the hands control the body.
Yep.
And, it just continues on from there. But probably one of my favorite parts, after he's fairly healed, he's going to go back home to his wife, is the wedding band not fitting on his hand. I don't know. That stuck with me. I was like, oh, the feelings.
Oh, yes. Yes. So one of the most interesting parts is the, getting into the major sort of plot line. What really jumped out at me is the fact that so many modern horror movies have really utilized the same sort of storytelling technique for their own sort of jump scares. So like I didn't really look it up, but I think it was called The Eye. Was it a Jessica Alba movie where she got somebody else's eyes, like a organ transplant?
Oh, okay.
And then like she can now see a spiritual realm that's evil and wants to kill somebody or something like that. But like that type of horror movie is very common nowadays, where a main character gets in an accident of some sorts, and they need to have an organ transplant, but the organ that they transplanted from is there's some evil attached to it somehow.
Yeah.
And that leads to inevitable some sort of creepiness, freakiness, and evil stuff, spirits or murderers' hands, like, and that all not 100%, but a big chunk of it owes its debt to this movie, if you think about it, right?
Because I've seen that in other themes too. I read the anime and manga every so often, and I'm thinking of one particular that, you know, this kid gets into a bad accident because he's being attacked by this demon girl, whatever, you know. Anyway, she gets killed, and he's half dead, so they think they're both human, so they give him her organs, and then he becomes, you know, a devil or something. It's like really popular in Japan. I haven't finished the story, but that's basically the same concept. He gets organs transplanted into his body to save his life, except now he's hindered by the toxins from the, you know, the other person.
Right. Essentially, the theme or motif of these works is that, you know, what is it that makes the soul, and what defines the humanity piece of the spirit? Is it just like the physical realm, or what's tied to the physical realm? And if you transplant that, does it alter your nature and stuff like that? That's the type of questions that movies like this one, and maybe all the horror movies that since have tried to copy this theme, have been struggling with talking about. And certainly the Japanese animation genre as a whole loves to talk about stuff like that.
Yeah.
And you've got that one, and the most popular one that I can think of is the Evangelion. I forgot the guy's name, but have you heard of that one?
I have heard of it, but I don't know about that one.
It's a
I was
classic.
talking about
So.
Tokyo Ghoul, which is more popular nowadays, but
Yeah.
I have heard of
But
that one.
those works now owe its debt to stuff like Evangelion, which is all about the human spirit and how it transcends the mech, like mecha or robotics, whether that's got a life of its own biologically or not. And does AI evolve out of that? And there's all this complex topics beyond that. But the point is, it's all about the questioning of who defines, like, how are you defined by? And that's the kind of the big part of this movie, and how so many other works after this movie, you know, it's not, I don't think it's always directly inspired by this movie, but certainly, like you were just bringing up, so many works have been sort of talking about these themes. And I feel like this movie does this type of theme greatly, where it extrapolates, like, well, I got this hand, but oh no, am I the murderer? And then it goes down that rabbit hole. And it's based on a book, right? It's also just like books like this and works like this is so classical in the sense that it's just such a very common type of story technique, but it's probably one of the first movies to bring this to life after Caligari, certainly himself. And, you know, certainly that movie and this movie often deals with that, the whole notion of identity, and also just shadows.
Yeah.
Darkness and
Lots
shadows.
of shadows.
And what lives in between everything. And it's very spooky and freaky, right? And that's really but I personally found that the technique, just like Caligari, the way it was shot is incredibly, incredibly beautiful. Because of just like, even in the opening scenes, like you were saying, the train, but yes, beyond the train, like the way he used the background to the foreground is just amazing throughout the movie. Where he would, the lighting of the movie is even better than Caligari, because I hadn't seen this movie yet, because I don't think it was available 20 years ago. But when I saw Caligari, I really fell in love with the sets, and I certainly noticed the lighting. But I felt like there were other German directors that were really good with it, like F.W. Bernard and others, Fritz Lang. They all loved the lighting, but also apparently they all have very sort of amazing eyes on how to paint the film cell with light and darkness, and I really love that. Have you heard of the term? May have used this before.
Mise en scene?
That's certainly a big part of it for sure. But the other term was in classical painting, when you the masters during the Renaissance era in the 1600s, 1700s, the Enlightenment or whatever you call it, and they had a lot of Italian artists, and they were painting portraits too, certainly, but when they're painting people, they also painted how the light and the darkness and the shadows fell on the human form. So they often have bodies draped with cloth, like white cloth, and then how the lights affect that. And the term that they use is called chiaroscuro.
I've heard
play
of that.
between light and shadow, and that's what reminds me of, because that I often use that along with a lot of F.W. Murnau and First Lang movies, because they've mastered. It's so brilliant in all of their movies. But I guess I hadn't really realized how broad it was, apparently, in that, including this guy's in the industry, it's like almost dime a dozen. Everybody, at least looking back now, I'm not sure everybody's doing it, but certainly this guy was doing in great extravagance in this movie. So you got like the wife Yvonne in the beginning, just getting up, and how the light and the shadow just plays with the way she was with the nightgown getting dressed, and also throughout the movie with the flower and the living quarters and begging the doctor to do stuff, and just even the is it the police station or cops or whatever at the end, all throughout the movie. Anytime the light and shadow falls on her, but like a painting, right? But also the Orlac, the main character as well. Any of the characters, it's just astonishing. And I remember many of the shots when the characters are in their door frames, there'd be like a light to either left or right, offset, lighting up from the back of their hair or the side, so you could see a light sort of lighting, and that's a modern technique. So if you watch like modern movies, it's like everywhere. It's like it's so second nature, nobody even thinks about it. But if you just pause a frame, essentially the lighting's what the difference between the Hollywood type polished look of a film versus like what you take from your phone or your camera and just film something. Because if you film something, there's no lighting. That's why it looks just like amateur. You know what I mean? So the difference between that and the Hollywood stuff is just that the lighting is incredible. It's just the way that there's so many lights, and they highlight certain aspects of how it illuminates people and sets and stuff like that. And a very common technique of lighting, I don't even know what the technical name is. I'm sure there is one. But it illuminates the person from behind, so you see a lit outline of their shape, in a contrast against the foreground, which is dark. So you got this lighted sort of silhouette almost of the side, but then and you see details a little bit in between that and the darkness. So that's very common too. But then also just the scenes, like the shape of all the scenes, the angles. And he did it already so brilliantly with the sets and color guard, but he did so much more in this throughout the movie. Yeah, throughout. Like from the chaos of the train wreck and extracting the guy out of the train, which I don't know if you did this, but I was looking for his hand at the train.
I was looking to see if they were showing where his hands were.
Exactly.
I didn't actually see them hanging out,
that's the brilliant part, because I don't know if they know, but it's like if you're gonna title a movie called The Hands of Orlac, and then you're gonna start showing the person, poor Orlac, you're kind of fascinated by his hands, right? Like you want to see the hands.
Yeah.
So I love how they hid, I think for sure intentionally, that you don't even see his hands, if they were mangled or maybe just gone. So I love that.
They did that too, because you learn that he's a concert pianist, and
right.
That is how they make their fortune. And really, you don't see his hands at all when he's behind the piano, because of that shot. So I'm only actually just realizing it now since we're talking about it. It's like, oh yeah, so are they his hands? We don't know.
Yeah. And I think that's the big sort of technical aspect, because again, all those little bits and pieces of mise-en-scene, chiaroscuro, all those things contributes and adds to making movies like this a classic. I think a lot of the modern movies, again, I seem so negative, Debbie Downer sometimes, all modern movies, but it's so hard-pressed to find any of them doing that. There's just so many movies that you watch in modern era. It's just like they don't really take their time to figure out the lighting, nor do they figure out time to do the setup of the scene, nor tell a story within a single scene itself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it was like the norm back then. That's what made these makes these movies classics, because they've trailblazed in all those areas on top of often great acting and all that stuff. So, and the acting's great too. Like when he first got the hand unwrapped, it reminds me of that Caligari scene when he was waking up. That whole opening the eyes thing, and I feel like this movie is sort of one scene or shot that was doing that was when they unwrapped the hands, which again is the whole title of the movie and the theme of the movie, but they took quite a bit of time just to show his reaction.
Yeah, it was very subtle, but you know, it's he's taking in what has just happened. He's in shock. He can't, you know, you know, your brain isn't quite right when, you know, something like that's being revealed. So I thought it was very well done.
Yeah, it's like a very modern acting technique. Very, very, very much like what we're seeing today versus the theatricality of some of the performances back then. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that was big. Another thing that jumped out at me. Anything else that struck you?
Definitely just a lot of, it's like we're also saying how everything is like, it is very modern. So, you know, you can feel what the character's feeling when he first goes to the piano after being in this accident, and then, you know, he just can't play. I'm really wondering if it's because he thinks he can't play, or because, I mean, you know, he has new hands. You know, it's obviously nowadays with modern technology and medicine, you'd have to fix all the nerves, and you know, he wouldn't be able to play. But that's just a great scene. That you can feel his despair, and you know, Yvonne being behind him, her pain towards, you know, her husband, her lover. It's that part's one of my favorite standout scenes. And then eventually going back to that scene where he's hiding the knife in the piano. It's, you know, it's all I can't put words to it.
Well, like I said, everything is all adding to the fact that this is a great movie. You know, all those small bits and pieces that you were mentioning, and sometimes the ineffable nature of the movies is the best part. I can't even describe what it is, but you know that when you watch it, you just feel like this is an amazing piece of work. And after, at least for me, sometimes you watch these movies multiple times, you realize how deep they go, and the sort of the types of questions and story ideas that they were trying to raise in these movies and have discussions for people to think about were pretty incredible, were pretty amazing, you know. And it's a little bit, it's not exactly Faustian. It's not really making a deal with the devil, but it feels a little bit like that. It feels like it's, you know, what has he gotten himself into with his hands, you know? So, another thing that I noticed throughout the movie is almost all the characters had something to do with their hands, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, like, the surgeon has to use his hands to reattach the hand, and the flowers were arranged by the wife with her hands. Lots of discussions about husband and wife using hands to sort of love one another and touch each other and touch and all that stuff. Certainly his piano is very, you know, and of course even the murder weapon was close combat hand. It wasn't just a random gun. You shoot from a distance. It's not impersonal. Even the murder weapon down to that is hand to hand. And how the cops eventually find everything was, you know, manual, like hand. So,
and fingerprints everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. Like everything was tied to some sort of a manual, literally like hand-based type theme. So I thought that was interesting. That even just that one aspect of the movie alone was so well thought of. Right? Like who thinks about movies like that these days, you know?
It's exactly. That's what also makes us film just, it's, just comparing it to Caligari, it's obviously made later in time, but just direction from, you can tell that the actor has grown. Robert Wiene has grown as a director. He's always, you can tell they're always thinking of something to make this film, like, I don't know, it's hard. It's exactly what I was trying to explain. It's like, it's everything you need is right there.
Right.
Yeah. Except what's there is I can't talk about it because I just explode with words.
Yeah, it's like Disney nowadays in their corporate structure, they often have a phrase in there called plussing it, which means if you when they made Avengers, they're like, okay, it's good now, but how do you make it even better? Like, how do you make it plus something, add something to it, some additive to it that will make it even better than what it is. So that's what they're always striving for. I think is why the Marvel stuff is pretty stellar, but that's kind of the overall Disney mantra. And I think that's what you're getting at, is that this guy's movie is always it feels like there's always some aspects of the movie, whether it's set design, acting, lighting, direction, set piece, costumes, even I feel like the music, I don't know if it was written originally with it, but it's just everything about it felt like it was trying to be better than what it was at every step of the way.
Yeah, I definitely agree about it. And what also, makes this movie so, coming from horror, I thought it was just a great drama, too. I didn't even think so much that it was a drama. Of course, it has its creep elements to it, but it was definitely more of a drama for me because I just wanted to know what's going to happen, what's going on. Is he going to kill someone? Did he kill someone?
But that's the best horror, though.
The thrillers, yeah.
If you look at the classic horrors, the best horrors, even in the modern times, remember we talked about I don't remember if it was on podcast or not, but it was recorded or not, but it was like Jordan Peele stuff now, right? About Get Out and also Us.
So good.
If you haven't seen it yet. They're all just very character-based. There's like very little gore, right? And so that's the whole point, is that it's the drama and it's the story driving sort of the story forward. And it's not always just about like somebody chopping somebody's limbs off or whatever. It's all about like the story.
The mind and psychological. I love thrillers. So
but it's all freaky though, right?
Yeah.
Like, even though there's an element of like, it's it's psychological that he thinks that way. And certainly the movie, with all the freakiness, was trying to externally show you how psychologically disturbed that he was to inherit the hand of a murder and how it affected him. But also, on top of that, could it be that he was hallucinating for sure? So you don't know. And that's the beautiful part of this movie, right? You could take it so many ways.
Let's see. What else? Let's see. Another thing that stood out to me, I was wondering this too, is that how much of this was painted sets. I thought there was a lot of forced perspective, especially when they were going to Orlac's senior's place. That part was pretty interesting too. To me it kind of just felt, I don't know, not so much thrown in there, but they never really talked about his father before, and then all of a sudden, we need money, let's go to your father. Right. It's just like, that was the only part for me that, besides still being an interesting additive to this film, I don't know, there was just no indication that I had realized earlier in the film to be like, oh, okay, why don't you like him?
Yeah, there's certainly I think these type of movies, they won't always explain all the context in the movie right away. It assumes so many things that you just drop yourself into the story. It's not gonna sort of write all the background narratives and for everybody. So you have to just watch, as you're watching the movie, you have to kind of feel like what the dad's sort of relationship with each of the their in-laws or the offsprings. I thought that was interesting. You could just read it right there, you know. They won't give you a big backstory. They're just like, oh, just by their pure interaction, you'll know what they are. You know what I mean?
Mm.
And that's the beautiful part of movies like this. It's a shorthand rather than having multiple scenes of explaining what their relationships are. It just shows you.
True. I mean, that can be better now that you say it like that. But at the same time, you know, maybe it's just because, you know, we're in the modern era, so you have to have a detailed explanation for everything. When back then it's just like, nope, doing it like this.
But even now, there are movies like that. It's not popular.
Yeah.
So for example, like I think I mentioned before, Roma is exactly like that. So if you watch that, it's like nobody's going to tell you what the whole story is. There's no A to B to Z of what the story is. It's just you get parachuted into the story and just have to experience it. And a lot of movies in the beginning certainly were like that. Very little context. You can kind of parachute and drop into this middle of the story and kind of have to use your head kind of, or your heart, and try to feel your way or think your way through the story on what it is. And the best movies do both, right? It's both entertaining, but also makes you think and also makes you feel something sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like this movie does all those things and more. Certainly made me think a lot. Also, like you were saying, many scenes that you felt like for these characters, and the acting is amazing, right? Like the main actor.
Conrad is a great actor. Yeah.
Both the, I mean, thinking back, I guess, I watching this made me appreciate his performance in the Caligari, where he plays Cesare, which I think I highlighted too when he was waking up with his eyes. That it was quite an interesting performance for a silent film of that time.
Yeah, we were talking about that because it was good for, you know, for, you know, context, and for its time, you're like, whoa, extra freaky.
yeah, exactly. And this one even more so with the hands. Like, in some ways, the whole movie rests on his acting with his hands. Right? Like, the movie's titled The Hands of the Main Character, Paul. Like, but also the entire theme and the entire drive and the entire crux of the whole story rests on how he can show you what his struggles are with inheriting these hands. And if that fails, the whole movie fails. Right?
Yeah, I agree.
So the fact that he could, with the unbandaging scene, show that's probably the most important part, and he certainly, you know, came through with a stellar performance. But also throughout that, like, right straight till the end. And I think this is one of the reasons why, at least many reviewers have said, that he lasted so long even after the talkies came around, that he was already performing at such a high caliber that just adding dialogue in is not a problem, you know? So that part was interesting.
Well, because he uses his, you know, your body as an instrument when you're an actor. So because I'm just agreeing with what you're saying, because he was so attuned to how his body worked, you know, the voice is just another part of your body. So no wonder he wouldn't succeed at that as well. Right,
exactly. Any other themes I think I haven't really gotten to?
Trying to think of let's talk about the maid. I was a little weirded out. The maid. I was like, what? I don't know. She's like the gal pal of Yvonne, his wife.
Right.
But then it's like secret mistress. I was so confused. I was like, what are you doing?
Yeah, it's again, wasn't Freud German too?
Sure.
Pretty sure,
I think
right?
it was.
I think it was. So, like, it has one of the many themes that this movie deals with. Like, that's the marks of the great movies. Is it tackles so many different things at the same time. You know, in addition to the complex nature of the nature versus nature, is that nurtured versus nature aspect. On top of that, it's also dealing with the id and sort of all the Freudian psychology. You know, that was of its time. It was Austrian. That's what it was. I looked it up, which is very close by. So certainly what Freud's research has done in the turn of the century has a massive, massive effect, right, on
Oh yeah.
all things now, but even back then when it first came out, certainly was humongous, and it would have certainly affected movies. And in fact, we know for a fact that back in Caligari, it was certainly a big part of it because it really delved into psychological storytelling, and I wouldn't doubt it for one moment that this movie also was very similarly impacted greatly. And so I think in some ways that was sort of the take on the whole maid aspects, whether the hand has resorted to just the base id feelings of sex and violence, essentially. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so that I feel like that scene was symbolic of just the most base nature of what the hand represents, which is just the nature of sort of just without any mind to control it. It would just be the base level of what it is, and that's what I think that scene plays to. Whereas other scenes talks more about like I get, was it the doctor, the police, or somebody was saying you have control over.
Oh, the doctor, Dr. Saras, I think it was.
But you know what I mean? That whole
Yeah.
notion of like, you can't just say that it's your nature to do certain things and give yourself over to your nature. Like this hand's nature is to murder. Well, you can't just say that's it and blame that and start killing people, allowing the hands to kill people. The reality is you have control over your hands, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you make the decision, and that's the crux of the movie. It's in hindsight it's still a bit farcical, like that hand would actually transport the sort of be the murder.
Yeah.
Sort of means that by which the murder instinct DNA is transported into the human, because obviously they didn't know about DNA yet, but just the whole psychological struggle of nurture versus nature. I think that was the most fascinating aspect. Was you had that scene that talked about that highlighted that just down to the base nature, you just have sex and violence, which is part of the. It's oversimplified, I'm sure, with Freud's teachings, but like his psychoanalysis stuff, it is one aspect of it, just your sort of nature part. But then the doctor was like, your nurture also has helped you determine that what is moral, what is right. Like you need to have control over your baser instincts, or else it's gonna actually, like, you will commit those murders,
Mm.
And I think that's the beautiful part at the ending, which is that both of him and his wife, right? They went to try to clear the name, or just to tell the truth, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's what they went there for.
Right, exactly. So, and that proved to be true. Like, and then we found out it was the Conman who was trying to was a mimic or pretend to be the murder guy and with the head.
Yeah,
and
I think how it was is that he was friends with the murderer Vasseur, except he was the murderer, and I think he murdered Vasseur.
Right.
He put the blame on Vasseur, who ended up being killed.
Right.
Who Orlac did have his hands, but he was an innocent man. That was
so that's the whole sort of the reward for Orlac and his wife to come clean, is that in fact his hands weren't the murderous hands. They were innocent hands, right? That's the whole theme. And at least my interpretation of the ending was that by having control over your baser instincts, you win at the end, because you're able to discern with just basic moral understandings and teachings that you can have control over the instincts that might have bad tendencies, right? So I think that's the teaching. And then in fact, the whole thing was the twist, I guess, or the rug being pulled under, is that he didn't even have that to begin with. So his entire struggle was for naught, right?
Yeah. Because it even said, I think they mentioned in the film it had been a couple years since he had these hands as well, since he got the surgery.
Yeah, the progression
And I
of
was
time.
yeah, so that was a bit jolting as well. I was like, really? You know, you expect this all, you know, this film to be all wrapped within a certain amount of time, and then you're like, nope, 6 years later. Oh, okay.
Yep. But also it gives the struggle that much more weight, that he had to struggle that long to come to an understanding of who he personally is, you know.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that whole aspect is interesting. That the whole thing was, at the end of the day, it's just a big psychological block that he should have, you know, catered to. And I guess the assumption is that he'll resume playing piano normally.
I would hope so, yeah. But, you know, he can't even write with his own handwriting.
Because of the psychological block, right? So.
Yeah, I guess, you know what, I guess so. You know, now, you know, me thinking, well, you know, back to what I said before, well, technically, since his hands were reattached, you know, blah, 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 all those nerve endings aren't right.
Yeah.
But, yeah, exactly, the psychological block.
That's the whole notion of referencing Freud and its impact. That's one of the common sort of analysis of this movie, is that certainly the directors / writers had been impacted by all those sort of pioneers of psychoanalytics, you know.
Mm.
So yeah, it's always a brilliantly done movie one hadn't seen, and even in light of this month, it's also very topical because it's just freaky, right? Even if it was psychological, but that's the best horror, in my opinion.
Mm.
So.
I have to agree. We're looking at, you know, so many of these great films that were done at this time. It's, you know, it's just so hard to just pick only, you know, 4 to talk about this month.
That's what I mean, is that it's so amazing that even by 1924, that they're able to achieve this massive artistic success. I don't know if it was a financial success, but maybe I thought Caligari was pretty financially, but I don't remember if this was or not. But either way, it's just astonishing. Like I've been saying all along, is that in this silent film era, that like they were basically doing so many things that we're doing today, you know, like in terms of film technique, film language. The artistry has matured so rapidly, even before sound came along.
Yeah, I know. That is really amazing now that you're mentioning it, too. Because, you know, exactly, for me, just I'm watching this film where you're noticing the lighting, where to me it's just a normal thing, and I didn't even notice the lighting differences. So, you know, it's just that's why, once again, I enjoy watching these films, because we're picking them apart, and then you just learn something new, either from just the film, the director, the actors, or just the time period itself.
Right, because you're used to it. Like
I'm used to it.
You're
yeah.
now watching so much of the modern stuff, which is, you know, commonplace. You know, the way they light things, the way they do things, so with so much just what's called basic, you know, professional stuff. But like back then, they were just starting this out, and by 1920s, they accomplished that in a short span of 20 years. They basically has evolved to a degree where they've done almost all of the film language techniques that we know of today. You know.
Yeah, that is amazing.
It's pretty amazing. That's why I love that. And also, they did it through no predecessors. Like, there's no prior historic precedents before them. They really just did it from scratch.
Yeah, they winged it.
Yeah. Well, you know, they all influence one another, and they all evolve, I think, over time. But the point is, that that's why I love it. They just they just plow through everything and figure things out, and without any sort of prior sort of teachers of these techniques to them. You know, they just continue to build upon one another. So. Anything else that you found striking?
curious to know about this book and the author. But the movie was based on the novel by Maurice Bernard. So just basic curiosity, being what the true original story was like. I'm sure it was something similar. Just figuring out what made him compelled to write the story. Like, oh, what if he lost his hands? Oh, what if it's murder? I don't know, just kind of silly stuff like that. That's not so much film. But, it seemed like doing some research, Robert Wiene seemed to do a lot of screen adaptations from books. That was something I took away from doing my research. He did either whether it was a book or a stage production, he brought it to film. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I don't know too much about this author, but I know he was a contemporary of H.G. Wells, which is obviously a huge, science fiction, and there's actually some ties to this because he did another movie. I forgot what it's called. Dr. Learn? Book, sorry. He wrote another book he dedicated to H.G. Wells. It also had a very organ transplant type thing. Now, if you know H.G. Wells, he did a book called Dr. Moreau or Island Dr. Moreau or something like that. You know about that
Sounds
work, right?
familiar.
It's about
I know.
It's about a doctor who would it's like genetic engineering essentially. But of course, back then they didn't know about this DNA. So that what they did was they would take a head of a lion, attach it to a body of an elephant, with a leg of a leopard. I don't know, just mixing and matching things.
Ugh, some weird chimera
Yeah, and
stuff.
that's the book. That's the book. Is this mad scientist trying to create new things. So so this Renard person's book was similar to that, except it would also be not just animals, which is what H.G. Wells wrote about, but also for this author, the Renard author, Maurice Bernard, would write in this Dr. Learn. I think it's he. He wrote about not just between animals, but between plants and even machines. So that was interesting because that's like modern science fiction in some ways. The science fiction is great in general, but so it's like, have you seen Annihilation?
I have.
Yeah, so it's very similar.
That movie
concept.
gave me so much anxiety.
But that's the thing, is that those movies or works owes its heritage to the H.G. Wells and this Maurice, and also like these movies, And there's another one called Island of Lost Souls, a movie later on, 30, 40 years later, and Charles Lawton is in there. And amazing piece of work as well, based on the H.G. Wells, Dr. Moreau type, inspired by, I think. But anyways, so back to the topic is that's what he wrote I think he wrote in the 1920s, and he was essentially just making these books just like another book he's writing. So some of which got adapted into movies like this movie. So.
And actually, now that you're saying adapting too, I also doing research, they've made multiple versions of Hands of Orlac. I think they made 2 other versions. One was 1960, and I can't remember if another one came before or after that version, but I was like, what? How can you remake? Yeah, I don't know. How could you remake this?
What, this movie?
It was just, yeah, I think it said it had 2 other versions.
Oh, yeah. They had they did, what's it called? The 1935 Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre is a very famous actor from a long time ago, but he's huge. And 1935 called Mad Love, I think. And another one called The Hands of Orlac in 19...
I think that was the 1961.
Yeah, it was Christopher Lee. Yeah, 1960. So, but most of which is again inspired by the book. So, the Maurice Bernard book.
Still, it was just one of those things that I was very surprised to read because I was wondering, well, what are you changing? How is it similar? How is it different?
Well, you could check them out.
I could check them out. I mean,
I don't know if the 1935 one is available because older movies tend to be tougher to get. But I feel like certainly the 1961 for sure is probably around. So they did a much better archiving, saving movies post I say 1940s.
World War II.
Yeah, somewhere around there. 'Cause before then, it was hit and miss a lot of times. Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of those movies, like many of the movies we tackle now, it's just, I think you could go on and on and on, just because the topics and the themes and the things it talks about in the movies is so broad that you just, again, continue to learn about things. You know, like the movies are a gateway to learning about all sorts of knowledge. You know, like...
Yeah, they really are.
Yeah, like I'm not sure I know so much about, like, you know, Freud's stuff. I mean, I knew of him. I don't know all the details, but
I know, same. I took psychology in high school, and then, you know, nothing's really since.
Yeah, so when you watch this, it's like you start unpacking some of those other things. It's like, whoa, this is very interesting what they're talking about or trying to communicate, you know?
I agree. I'm trying to think of, you know, what else I can mention. Just talking about Conrad Veidt in general. So, just for the listeners, the Joker movie just came out this weekend, and I happened to, when I was looking up information on Conrad Veidt, they were talking about how the Joker character was, they based him off of one of Conrad Veidt's characters from The Laughing Man, which, and then they did the side-by-side photo, and I thought that was, you know, very interesting. That's just another movie I haven't watched personally. But, you know, it's, you know, basically they talked to the director in this article, and he's like, well, yeah, go watch this film if you haven't seen it. Yeah. A lot of it was referenced off older films from possibly the 20s and 30s, and I was like, wow.
Yep. It's a 1928 movie called The Man Who Laughs. It's a silent movie. It's directed by German expressionist Paul Linney. Again, all of these morbid, freaky stuff is always, not always, often the German expressionists. And Conrad is the carnival, freaky, grinning like character called Gwynplaine or Gwynplaine.
Yeah, some strange name.
So yeah, it's this character inspired the DC Comics, the Joker. So when you read the original comics, it was inspired by this actual character, which is based on a Victor Hugo novel with the same name, The Man Who Laughs. But when they made a movie of this, Conrad Veidt is the actor that played him. And so his freaky smile, which is on YouTube, you can just look at a clip of it. It is freaky, you know?
Yeah, I'm just looking at this. I pulled up the article too. It's amazing, just the similarities between the smile and just everything. It is Conrad. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, he's a stellar actor. He's one of the greats of that era of time. I don't think I've seen everything of his, but looking back, I'm certainly probably have seen bits and pieces and just didn't recognize him. You know, he's almost unrecognizable sometimes from one role to another. It's like a chameleon.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
But yeah, I mean, he inspired the comic book, which of course in later years inspired all of the subsequent Joker actors who based their characters on the comic book, which I don't know if they researched it, they would have known that it was inspired by this actor.
Yeah, I was just thinking that myself. Sometimes actors, you know, they just take it for, you know, take their salt, but, you know, others will, of course, do their research. But, I mean, to me, if I was going to do my research, I would just look at the comic book. I probably wouldn't look beyond that to be like, oh, hey, it's based on a character from a movie.
Well, you go far back enough, though. You might know. Yeah.
So that to me was also another, you know, who knew?
Yeah. It's a little bit like, this is kind of related, but the Magnificent Seven movie, which was remade recently by like Denzel Washington, Chris Pratt, and a bunch of people. But that was a takeoff of another older movie in the, I forgot when, 50s, 60s, 70s. I'm not actually very familiar with movies from the 40s through the 70s, maybe 80s. That's my blind spot for movies. I think I focus so much on silent movies that some of those era in between just not as familiar, except for the big ones, like Lawrence of Arabia. But anyways,
Right.
what was I saying? Oh, so Magnificent Seven then is a remake of a takeoff of Seven Samurai, which is the Akira Kurosawa, the Japanese director's movie, which is funny because if you go back even far enough, even Akira Kurosawa himself was inspired by early John Ford silent films, westerns. So it's so hilarious that this Western movie was inspired by this Japanese samurai movie, which was inspired by the Western to start with.
Yeah, that is really funny.
It was tracing through the DNA of stuff. And just the same thing with this Joker. And I'm glad you brought that up because I was thinking about it. I forgot about it until you just mentioned it. Isn't it interesting that so many of the themes in that movie is similar to this movie? Just the freaky nature of the person and freaky nature of just the themes of... I don't know. Have you seen the movie yet?
No, I haven't seen a movie in so long.
That's all right.
But, yeah.
I haven't seen it, but I heard so many from a lot of my friends that have seen it. And
everyone keeps saying, "Oh, it's great," or "Oh, it's awful." I'm just like, ugh, whatever.
Well, it depends on what you're looking for. I think if you're looking for a performance, you'll get it because Joaquin Phoenix is amazing. But if you're looking for just an amazing story, I think out of it, you might be hard pressed to find that because the Joker doesn't have an origin story in the comic books. I don't know if you know that. If you read all the comics. The reason why he's so successful, this is totally off topic now, but the reason why he's so successful is because he's a villain without a history. And that's why Heath Ledger's performance was great because when he was doing his the Joker, he would tell you different stories. But the point is, you don't know what his backstory is. But that's why he's so dangerous, right? The Joker. And so in this iteration, they're going to tell you his story, which you don't want to do because when you tell this story, it makes him less threatening. He's just this poor, screwed up soul.
That illusion is lost.
Exactly. So, getting back to tying into the movie that we just saw, there is some relationship to it because it has to do with just the way that the person is lost, right? So, this character, Paul Orlac, he's so sort of tied his identity to his hands that when it's taken away, and especially by this murderous hand, he's off kiltered. He's kind of a lost soul, and he's gone off the deep end. In some ways, this Joker character is also just gone off the deep end. You know what I mean? I don't know. There's some sort of thematic ties to it. I was thinking about it the other day. So.
Well, I'm glad I brought it up.
Right. So, was there any concluding thoughts about this? I feel like another classic one, for sure.
I'm glad that, the mystery was solved at the end. I guess that's a nice way to put it. They caught the bad guy. You found out our hero, quote unquote, is a good person. It was just, it wasn't exactly the ending that you were expecting, but I think everyone was happy with it.
Right,
I don't know. Right. I mean, I was just like, oh, okay, well, that's good to know. He's not a murderer.
Yeah.
But that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. It's, I mean, I pretty much shared all my thoughts as well. It's just, it's such a massive undertaking to just catalog all the different themes, all of the different topics that movies like this tackle. And that's what makes them great, because it isn't just about one simple story or what they often call these very derogatory terms called a melodrama. But, I mean, there are elements of that in a lot of silent films. But in general, it's just so many of the silent films also tackle very complex topics. I mean, so far, we've seen so many. Right? It's just every one of we've seen just broadens your idea or scope of what silent movies can be or ought to be. At least for me, All right. Well, I mean, do we need to have a rating? No, I don't like rating systems, but it's a pretty good movie. It's a classic. I feel like even though if you're listening and you know the ending now, it's still a great movie to watch because it's to me it's an experience if you can watch it, especially if they're replaying on a big screen and live accompaniment and stuff like that. Just seeing it in a darkened theater with a lot of light and shadow, and just especially in this movie in the beginning with there was a spotlight, like they shone the spotlight at the camera lens, like that's brilliant. Because later on in I think Rashomon by again Kurosawa, he pointed the camera directly through sun. The sun was shining directly into the camera. I was almost unheard of back then, except for this movie. It's not the sun, but they shone the light direct into the camera, which for cameras is really a big no-no because it just overwhelms the entire, frame and lens and with bright light. But it's just so brilliant, literally the way they did it. So I don't know. It's just the way the light and shadow plays in this movie. It's just a joy to watch. I think you could just watch that all day. Just the way the technique, the technical aspect is pretty amazing. On top of the fact that they did a pretty good acting story on top of that, and also thematically is, kind of just a big psychological study on nature versus nurture, which is I think that ultimately the theme I wanted to tie to Joker, by the way, is that's a lot of what that movie's about is your impact from the nature of who you are or the nurture of your environment that's impacting, transforming who you are as a person. That's more the point I was trying to get at. Okay, so we're going to wrap up this week. We'll be back more for next week. And again, thank you very much, Lily, and thank you, audiences, for listening and tuning in.
Yes, thank you.
And if you're able to, please leave a feedback to the Apple Podcast platforms or SoundCloud, Google podcast platforms, however you find us. The best way is to leave a comment there and addition to some ratings so that people can find us. And you can find our stuff at watchingsilentfilms.wordpress.com. That's watching silent films, plural films, .wordpress.com. And thank you once again, and we'll see you again in another week.